Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are in the country, and welcome to INSELA's webinar, Teaching and Learning for Students with Interrupted Formal Education and Refugee Backgrounds. My name is Kira Ballantyne. I'm the Acting Director of INSELA, the National Clearinghouse for English Language Acquisition, and I'm going to be your facilitator for today's webinar. Before I go ahead and turn over to Dr. Joanne Urrutia, the Deputy Director of OELA, I'd like to just mention one or two housekeeping items. First of all, this presentation will be recorded, so if you have colleagues or others who are unable to watch the live webinar today, then we will have a recording available for you in a couple of days. The PowerPoint for the presentation is available from download from INSELA's website from the page that referred you to the webinar today. So if you would like to print that out for your records, that's also available to you. And then finally, we'll be taking questions at the end of today's presentation. We'll have a question and answer period. However, you are welcome to enter your questions at any time in the chat box, and they will be reserved for the end of the session. I would like to now go ahead and introduce Dr. Joanne Urrutia, the Deputy Director of the Office for English Language Acquisition at the U.S. Department of Education. And Joanne, let me just remind you as well to turn your microphone on there.
So I guess you didn't hear anything I said before. So let me repeat it in case nobody heard what I said. I want to welcome all of you to this, our second webinar, addressing the needs of students with interrupted formal education. Like Kira said, my name is Joanne Urrutia, and I am the Deputy Director for the Office of English Language Acquisition in the U.S. Department of Education. Our office is sponsoring this webinar, and our office also is the responsible agency for funding the National Clearinghouse for English Language Acquisition. Today it is my pleasure to introduce two presenters that are going to share very important and valuable information. The first presenter, Myrna Ann Adkins, is the President and CEO of the Spring Institute for Intercultural Learning. She leads the marketing and development of the Institute, designs programs, and presents workshops in cross-cultural communication in international business and on managing effective and culturally diverse environments. She is a trainer and a consultant for the English Language Training Program, a technical assistance project sponsored by the Office of Refugee Resettlement. She teaches a course on cross-cultural communication for the World Trade Center certificate program and provides cross-cultural training for businesses. Follow Myrna Ann's presentation, we will have Andrea DeCapua. She is an education consultant and adjunct assistant professor at New York University. Her interests include second language acquisition, culture, and second language learners in the classroom. She specializes in teacher training for those working with English language learners and in intercultural training awareness. She provides assistance, coaching, and workshops and presents extensively at conferences both here and abroad. She is the author of numerous books and has developed an innovative instructional model for struggling English language learners. So I do not want to take any more of this precious time, and I will hand it over to Myrna Ann for her presentation. And again, thanks for joining us.
Good morning. I think the fact that it's actually morning or afternoon, depending on where you are, is one demonstration of the diversity that we are dealing with in our classrooms and the kind of experiences, even with marking time, that students, particularly those with interrupted education, interrupted formal education, bring to our classrooms. An understanding of what the students bring to the classroom, particularly those with interrupted formal education, understanding their backgrounds and their experiences, and also looking at specific strategies to aid their learning can be huge assets for teachers and for the school system. And I want to make just a further note about formal education. When we talk about SIFE, students with interrupted formal education, that formal part is very important to remember, because the fact that our students are not blank slates, but they are bringing lots of education and learning with them to the classroom, it just happens to be very different than what students born in the United States or those that have had formal education for many years bring. How we access and utilize the background can be very important. Most children in the United States have been getting ready for school literally since they were born. Students who come from other countries or have not had the opportunities for formal education or have had interrupted education come with very different backgrounds, but we need to remember that they are bringing learning. This definition of a trauma-informed system comes from United Way, and I was interested when I saw it because many different areas of concern, social work, mental health, other systems are now interested in looking at trauma-informed systems. But this definition could just as well read trauma-informed school districts, trauma-informed school, or trauma-informed classroom. Looking at trauma-informed teaching can be a huge asset for the students with interrupted formal education, and it can also be an asset and a gift to the teachers as they struggle with how to help all children in the classroom and how to integrate those who have not had formal education into the classroom. Teachers already carry a very heavy load, and it may look like we're asking for one more thing to be added. But being mindful of the high degree of possibility that students with interrupted education have experienced trauma can lead to new insights and actually can be very helpful as the students arrange their classroom, think about what rules they need to give to all of the students, and indeed what activities they do in the class. I'm going to look for a few minutes about the stressors in resettlement, and although in our title we do have refugees in there, I would submit that any student that is coming from outside the United States, and in fact some of those that may have been born here but have parents who came from outside the United States, in some degree experience the stressors of resettlement. Those who have come across the border, for example, south of the United States, they experience many of the same stressors, and there isn't time to go into all of those specifically. So I will focus a bit on what the refugee students bring to the classroom, because my experience is those are the populations that many teachers and school systems are dealing with. So let's look at migration first. The definition of a refugee is someone that is born outside of the United States. So this means that migration begins long before their journey to the U.S. With a few exceptions, people that are resettled in the United States, individuals or families, became a refugee outside of the borders. So they have already experienced potentially a lot of trauma and dislocation before they were certified to come to the U.S. And I won't go into all that background with Refugee 101, but there are places that you can access that. So there are so many new things to learn. Excuse me. People have already adjusted to a refugee camp or being in a place outside of their homeland. They've already become adjusted to different kinds of rules, and when they come to the United States, all of the rules may look different to them. Last week in a cultural orientation class, I had Bhutanese tell me that even how to eat was part of the acculturation. He said because the food is so different, we don't recognize the food and we don't know how to prepare it. And I started to talk to them about where they can get food that they might recognize, or how they can learn to prepare the food that they are getting and being given. And of course this affects the children that are coming then into the school. So for teachers, for school systems, to be able to learn about the different populations that are coming into the school maybe also seem like a daunting task, but very important if our schools and our teaching is going to be culturally informed and trauma informed. The background experiences that people have had before they come. What kind of orientation have they had? Have they had some education in the refugee camps or in other places? The Center for Applied Linguistics, CAL, has done backgrounders on almost all the refugee populations, and I will give their citation at the end of the presentation. So if you're not familiar with them, it is an excellent source for learning about the populations that are in the classrooms. UNHCR and others also have background information that I will give you. I want to say just a moment about being undocumented or having other family issues. Some of these kinds of things follow some of the same patterns that we're talking about for refugees in terms of the impact on the students in the classroom. And I just actually this morning read about a MPI, a Migration Policy Institute report that has come out that analyzes the impact on children that come from families that are undocumented. So there's no lack of considerations in this regard for us to take account of when we're trying to do the best we can to enable all children to learn. With refugees, we're looking at experiences from war, we're looking at experiences in the refugee camp, and another important thing to remember is that it is the adults that make the decision that resettlement will happen with a particular family. It's not the children. I remember when I moved my family from Michigan to Colorado, and we were trying to ease some of the pain for my young children. And the thing that they didn't want to leave the most was the apple tree in our backyard. And my husband and I brought all we could that was familiar to them, but we could not bring that apple tree. And when I think about the things that children have become used to, the pictures you've probably seen in the refugee camp, you know, what people did are very different than what they can do here for toys and for play. But recognizing what happens in those camps and how they have learned can have an impact on the classroom. Again, in one of the classes I recently taught, I asked a group of young men from Asia if they had played soccer, when they said that was one thing they did when they were under stress. And they said, oh yes, they played at least every day. I said if you had the opportunity to play soccer, we were actually talking about football, to use their language. And they said, oh no, they couldn't play football in the United States. And yet, of course, there are many programs for refugees and immigrants to get involved in with football. But these newcomers didn't know how to do that. And I got to thinking, both our schools and my own program that helps people learn English and helps the families and the students adjust to the culture, we often focus on things that may not be the most relevant for initial adjustment and even long-term adjustment, like how can I get involved in playing football. We also have to look at the family resettlement experience when we're thinking about the children in the classrooms. The ongoing concern about finding jobs, housing, how do I learn English? And for parents, how do I get engaged with the school, a concept that is absolutely foreign to most of the refugee cultures. So learning about where the students come from. These days, many of them are from Burma, Bhutanese from Nepal, coming from Nepal, people from Iraq, and the countries in Africa, Sudan, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Somalia. What particularly are they bringing to the classroom we need to know about? And then getting ready for the influx that we are expecting of refugees from the Democratic Republic of Congo. what we know about that group, and that many of the students who will be in our classroom come from families with single parents, usually single mothers, that have experienced extreme trauma as part of the resettlement experience. What difference is immigration reform going to make as we go forward and have, again, new populations in our classrooms? This is a picture that was drawn by a young Somali student. Our cultural orientation class has facilities for childcare in the next room. And a mother had given the child some markers and a piece of paper because he did not want to stay in the childcare room. He wanted to be in the classroom. She was extremely concerned when she saw what this child drew with no instruction, just handed a piece of paper and some markers. But what he drew was a tank with a turret on top, one of which in Somalia he had probably seen very frequently. This was drawn by a 6-year-old, but this 6-year-old is going to be in someone's classroom before very long, bringing this gift of the background of an experience of every day seeing these kinds of tanks in his world. So what is mental health and why is it important in refugee resettlement? That may seem obvious, but digging a little deeper on how it impacts the students in the classroom. And when I'm doing a real-time workshop, I also like to talk about the mental health of the teachers and the people in the school because I think it's a concern for all of us. But I think asking the question, what is mental health? What do we think about in that regard? And I want to go back just a minute to this cultural orientation class that I mentioned that I was teaching a week ago. And this class was for the teachers. But when I asked what caused them stress now that they were here, they mentioned not having money. They mentioned jobs. They mentioned concern for their kids, for their children. They mentioned how they could help their children be successful in the school. And then one thing I had not heard before, one of the mothers said, I am very worried because I am afraid to let my children go outside. I was a bit taken aback by this because I've seen lots of pictures in the refugee camp. I have visited refugee camps. But I realized that this was a couple weeks after the Boston Marathon tragic event. Here we have a refugee coming from a war-torn area, keeping her children inside because she's afraid what will happen to them if they go outside. We talked about this more, and she was even afraid what would happen to them if they went to the school. So when we look at the children that are in our classrooms and we think about what does mental health mean, we often use that term in the United States. We really mean mental illness. But in this case, I'm talking about mental health. What does it look like for students? And I invite you to think about that. Unfortunately, in this webinar, we can't have an interaction about that. But I'm sure you would say things like, for the students, being able to focus, being able to build relationships, feeling secure, having friendships, most of the time feeling on a level plane, or if there is huge stress or you're angry or you're upset, being able to come back and be settled again. So that's the kind of environment that our classrooms have the opportunity to create that may not have existed for the students ever in their experience. So when we look at the mental health in resettlement, sorry, I just went backwards and I didn't mean to. When we look at that mental health in resettlement, we have things like the initial shock of coming to a new country and trying to get some normality, some routines. Some people cope very well. After all, the refugee experience is one of people that have been figuring out how to cope with tragedy for a long time. Having support that you can get in the schools. And then opportunities to be productive. And we're going to come back to that because that is part of what the school system and the classroom can give to the students that they may not find elsewhere. So why is mental health important to the schools? This may seem obvious, but what this answer tells us about the system, how we arrange the structures, what are the rules, and what are the class activities, can be very important in answering the question of how we help students with interrupted formal education, how we help them achieve, and how we help them become part of our school system that then is achieving in a world that is still grappling with how we are accountable and how we measure success. Why are the schools important for mental health? And I think this is self-evident from some of the bullet points here. A socialization and acculturation can happen for the students, for the people that we're talking about in this webinar, maybe better than any place else. Social support that can come from their peers, interaction with peers can get in the way of mental health also. I come back again to structure and routine. So important to mental health and very important for people coming from systems where the rules and the structures they do don't exist. And then the other thing about the schools, of course, is the opportunity to reach out to the parents. And both show support for their native culture while they're readjusting. And for me, bringing some of that native culture into the classroom is not only important for the students we're talking about, but helping all students in the classroom learn to live in a multicultural world, and probably good for their mental health as well. So the challenge for the schools are many, of course, working with an increasingly diverse student body, and that's, we know from the demographics, that's going to be more and more the case. Students with very many different backgrounds, and again, we could spend a whole webinar on the psychological problems or the learning disabilities, and we've made swings over the years in going from diagnosing learning disabilities for almost everybody that was learning English and trying to be in the school, to now I hear school systems talk about how difficult it is to get an English language learner assistance if in fact there is a learning disability. How in fact do we even assess that as an issue? Dealing with behavioral issues, and I'll come back to that in just a moment, and then also looking at the multiple levels and the multiple needs, particularly when we have people in age-appropriate classes, but they may not have much of the background that they need to be in that aged classroom. The challenges for the students. The number one that we hear from both parents and students who have come from other countries is the challenge of the language. Culture shock. The students don't often talk about culture shock. It's a concept that may not be known, but in fact we'll see it. And to recognize culture shock in the classroom, whether it's students not understanding the rules, we've had many experiences where limited English speakers didn't go to the bathroom all day because even though the school system thought it was very clear when and how to do that, it was an unknown for the students really. And we've had some very dramatic incidences where that needed to be more explicit. And then one of the most important ones, and I think our next presenter will talk about this and how to do this, but understanding the rules. And I invite you all to look at how do you let the students know what the rules are in your classroom. I'm sure many of you write them, you give them orally, but I think we have to be very mindful of how many of those rules are implicit and we don't make them explicit. And we particularly don't make them explicit for students that are coming with the kind of backgrounds we've been talking about, steeped in trauma. So how can we be sure that our rules are explicit and we're not assuming that they are known, because many of the students in our classroom have been dealing with these rules long before they came to school system. I think about the behavior that I tried to inculcate in my children that were preparing them for school, but I wouldn't have been doing that if I had been in a refugee camp. And I think about my teaching when I was in the Peace Corps and how I had to learn how working in that school, and I think you'll see a picture later on in the next presentation of a school that reminded me when I saw very much of the school that I taught in. And the rules there were very different, the assumptions. And then coping with past trauma, which probably will not appear explicitly in our classrooms. It might. You need to be ready for that, but we need to be aware that our students are dealing with that, even if they're not aware of it and it doesn't appear. Culture shock is a very real phenomenon. I'm not sure how we've traditionally looked at it for people going to a new culture fits refugees and immigrants who are coming to our schools and to our country, but I think it's a concept we need to be sure we look at. Again, when in our program, when we're going through a cultural orientation program with newcomers, by and large, people that have been here 2 months, 3 months or less, when we talk about this concept and we talk about the honeymoon they were probably on before they came, thinking about coming to the United States, although the concept fails a little bit because most refugees were also very mindful of what they were leaving behind, friends and family and the familiar. But most people will say they had that honeymoon experience. But very quickly they go into culture shock. With the class of Bhutanese I was telling you I was with last week, it was very unusual, and I've been working with this for many, many years. They almost all said they were still on the honeymoon. They were excited, they were learning new things, and they were adjusting to this culture in their consciousness. Of course, the Bhutanese group has experienced a higher rate of suicide than any refugee group we've had to date. We still don't have that all figured out, but there are studies beginning to come out that analyze that. But I couldn't help wondering if their experience with the culture shock curve that was so different than what I've experienced before had something to do with how their later on adjustment is going. So very quickly we'll look at academic engagement for the students on the cognitive, behavioral, and relationship level. Cognitive engagement, of course, is making sure the students are cognitively engaged in what they're learning. It's the opposite of boredom. And if the students aren't bored, if you see they're academically engaged, you probably are not dealing with behavior issues. And of course you can turn that around when you do have behavioral issues and trying to see what's happened and are they cognitively engaged. Looking at this behavioral engagement, when students find they can't perform the academic tasks and when there are issues with that, not always, but we may find that's when they get behavioral issues. And these are some of the things that we can look at as indicators of that behavioral engagement. Being behaviorally engaged is a predictor by research of academic performance. Then being engaged relationally, which is often some of the hardest activities for the students and for us to figure out. If a student feels connected to the teachers and their peers and others in the school, they will perform better in the classroom. They need a sense of belonging for their mental health. They need a sense where they can feel safe. And this kind of engagement obviously will have something to do with their behavior as well. And then the predictors of academic engagement. One of the most important here is thinking about what do we do in our classroom to make sure that all of our students, but those with interrupted formal education, can do the work and feel that they can do the work. It's very important as we go forward and trying to figure out how to engage them and how to meet them where they are, which is a huge challenge for teachers in the multi-level classrooms that we have these days. So we can facilitate that academic engagement through materials and through meaning. And this is not a given for students where English may not be their first language and where they've had interrupted education. Affirmation, how we build confidence. I know teachers are concerned about this for all of the students in the class. But students who have experienced trauma, students coming from a refugee background or an immigration background where they do not feel affirmed and they have maybe been living in the shadows, their families have been living in the shadows, this is a huge task, and it's a huge task to ask the school system to take on. I think every day if we ask ourselves in our classes, have all students, but again focusing on those with interrupted education, has there been at least one task in that day that the students can do? And as we look at the positive attitudes for a school that was in an earlier slide, if the students feel they can do the activities, they can be successful, then of course this is going to make a lot of difference in their confidence and their positive attitude towards being in school, because the dropout rate is a huge challenge, as you know, with students with interrupted formal education. So being mindful of at least one activity the student with interrupted education can do well, one place where they know they have succeeded, and you can acknowledge them for that. My time is drawing to an end here, but I want to acknowledge that this is not an easy task. And I like this slide because I can't tell and ask you what you are seeing when you look at this. Some of you, I'm sure, saw an old woman, others saw a young woman. Many of you can flip back and forth. Interesting, as I look at it right now, I can flip back and forth. But it depends on when we're looking, how we're looking, where we're looking, what we see, and who it is we have in front of us in the classroom, frankly, what our perception of that student and the trauma and what it is we can do to help that person succeed. And our job, maybe most importantly, is to listen and to bring our hearts into the situation with students who for themselves are probably going back and forth in terms of their own perception in what they are doing and can do in the school. So this student who drew this picture of the tank and will be in your classroom in a couple years, thinking about that person with interrupted education and what can we do while serving all of the other students, what can we do to help this student with the trauma? We're going to talk about specific activities in the next section. Before I end, I want to acknowledge Dr. Dina Bierman, who is at the University of Illinois in Chicago. Much of this work comes from work that we have done together, presentations we've done together. She spent a lot of time in the Chicago schools and doing research for many, many years with refugees and immigrants, and she came at a very young age as a refugee herself. One of the things I've added to many of my presentations is a picture of her before she came, when she was in the Pioneers, the club for young communists in Russia. And she brought that with her. And I think it's fortunate she's bringing it to her teaching at the University of Illinois. These are references that will be available, and I won't say more about them except to point out the recent book that has come out, Supporting and Educating Traumatized Students, a guide for school-based professionals, that has recently come out of Oxford University Press. I apologize for not having the editors' names there. But along with some others that are in the Refugee Network, there is a chapter on supporting refugees and immigrants who are in classes who have experienced trauma, and I invite you to look at that. And now I think it's time to, with this as a background, look at the specific strategies and what do we do with all of this in the classroom.
Thank you so much, Myrna Ann. This is Kira Valentine here again. Just before I go ahead and introduce Andrea DeCapua, what I'd like to do is just to remind you all, if you came a little late to our presentation today, first of all, that this webinar is being recorded, and so there is a recording that will be available after the webinar is over. And second, we do also have the PowerPoint of the webinar available on our website if you'd like to download and print that. We'll be saving questions until the end, but do please feel free to type your questions into the chat room window at any time during the session, and we can refer to those at the end of the event. Now I'd like to turn over to Andrea DeCapua.
Okay. Can everyone hear me? I want to just check that the mic is on correctly. Yes?
Your sound is good. Thank you, Andrea.
Great. Okay. Well, I want to thank you, Kira, for introducing me, and thank you, Myrna Ann, for giving such a great presentation and providing the background to my presentation. I think that our listeners are going to find that there are important parallels in our work. What I'd like to begin with now is a quote. Basically, I wanted to begin with this quote to not only draw your attention to the importance of culture, but kind of build again on what Myrna Ann was talking about. So the idea is that culture influences how we perceive and understand the world, and it's acting as a filter which is shaping our worldviews, including, and what we're going to look at a lot today, is how we learn and how we teach, and our assumptions about teaching and learning. So I'm going to start my presentation by looking at two very different cultural perspectives. Specifically, I'm going to be looking at two different learning paradigms. I'm going to build on this understanding to see how teachers can help the students with limited or interrupted formal education succeed in their schools, and I'm going to be looking at some specific classroom applications. So if you look at the slide, the next slide, we've got informal ways of learning and formal education, both of which Myrna touched upon briefly, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about. On the first set on the left, you'll notice this is what we call informal ways of learning. It's learning and teaching that takes place through the socio-cultural practices of people's communities. People learn by observing and doing the tasks that are important to them, to their families, to the communities. Tasks are important in daily life. Learning occurs when it is needed and in the very real sense of what educators talk about learning paralleling life. Okay? Just to give an example, if you want to learn about farming, you don't go study in farming for 4 years and then go out to the field. You do it as you learn it. In informal ways of learning, literacy is not integral. It's not even necessary to participate in such learning, although, of course, there may be some literacy skills, and there may be some limited schooling illustrated by the school below. Now, those who have participated primarily in informal ways of learning have developed what we call pragmatic types of thinking, with an emphasis on the here and now. Basically, I learn what I need, and I learn as I need it. And we can contrast this type of learning with formal education. And formal education is learning closely associated with literacy, with written media, with print resources. It's learning where literacy is essential. It's necessary in order to participate. Print is the norm. Seeing orality or limited literacy is considered a deficit. There's a lot of learning, most of learning has future relevance. You're not learning for the moment, but you're learning for life after school, or you're learning for the next course, or maybe just for the test, but it's always something geared toward the future. And a lot of the learning is teaching students how to learn, which goes back to something Myrna Ann mentioned earlier, and I'll build in a moment. Learning is centered on decontextualized concepts and tasks that are removed again from the daily life and experience. And the rules of school, okay, or how to do school, are part of the earliest years of schooling and are implicitly understood by later years. And I'm going to explain this a little bit more. All of us listening today, participating in this webinar, have participated in formal schooling. And so we have developed the ability, in fact, the propensity to think in academic ways. Okay, this is an example of an implicit internalized behavior. And we start this training in the earliest years. And I have an illustration of a little toy up in the upper right-hand corner. I'm sure for many of our listeners this is very familiar. What kind of it's not just a toy. What it is, children, young children are practicing categorizing and sorting based on what's salient here, shape, not color, right? So the activity, this type of activity is preparation and early training for participation in formal education. It's illustrated by the bottom picture on the bottom right. So children are learning to think academically at a very young age. So if we think about who our populations that we're talking about. My question says, who are SIFE? And probably many of you are wondering what this means. Helene Marshall, and I want to emphasize that she is an integral part of my presentation and my work with a colleague and researcher and co-writer. We talk about SIFE rather than SIFE because we're looking at students who are not only have interrupted formal education, but they also have limited. So they may come to our schools with the requisite number of years in school, but the resources, opportunities for true formal education were lacking, whether it's limited resources such as textbooks, or maybe the teachers weren't trained, or it was primarily rote learning or whatever. So if you hear me use the term SLIFE, I'm trying to include that population of students who are not just interrupted, but also limited. But going back to who they are, these are students because they come from informal ways of learning. They prefer to gather and transmit information orally. They want to use the oral means rather than any kind of written mode. They're used to this pragmatic learning with immediate relevance, and given the kinds of cultures most of the students come from, they're collectivistic, so they tend to feel more comfortable working together and sharing responsibility. And Myrna Ann alluded to a little bit of that in her presentation. We'll look at that a little bit more also. So what exactly are their needs of SLIFE? And I'm sure the students with limited interrupted learning, formal education, as soon as it comes to your mind, the first thing that you're going to say is they need to develop basic literacy skills. Yes, absolutely. And secondly, of course, they need to learn basic and grade level subject area concepts without a question. Now, Helene Marshall and I, in our work, we've also emphasized two other aspects, namely, they need to develop academic ways of thinking, and they need to adapt to cultural differences in learning and teaching. Remember, they're coming from a different learning paradigm with different ways of viewing and understanding the world. Because they are coming from these different ways of learning, all right, they need to learn how to learn in our school settings and become prepared for and adapt in academic ways of thinking. Now, if you remember at the very beginning of my presentation that I mentioned, we talked about cultural lenses shaping how we learn and how we teach and assumptions. I want to turn your attention to my next slide, which is the assumption slide. And basically, we're going to talk about the assumptions that we as teachers and learners in formal education and as products of this system. Assumptions are things that we aren't aware of, and it's very hard for us to see the other since our cultural lenses are filtering how we see and interpret the world. What happens is we pay attention to what our minds have trained us to do, been trained to do. So first, as products of individualistic culture as the U.S., we assume that the goals of instruction are to produce independent learners, okay? Learners who can learn on their own, learners who can work on their own. If we think, for example, of scaffolding, that favorite term in education, what exactly is the concept behind scaffolding? If you think about it, well, we're supposed to, as teachers, provide support and gradually remove it until the learner can learn and work independently. In addition, in formal education, learning isn't about, as I mentioned earlier, immediate relevance. The idea is not that what the students are learning they're going to be able to use now is going to have immediate relevance. It's relevance for the future. Learning how to learn, learning for the next course, learning for the test, and so on. Now, the second set of assumptions that teachers and learners have is that the learners are going to bring along an urge to compete and excel as an individual. The notions of individual merit and individual achievement. However, these students with a limited interrupted formal education are frequently members of collectivistic cultures, as I mentioned earlier, where the focus is more on the group, personal relationship, interconnectedness. Of course, they want to succeed, all right, but that achievement is often sought as a group goal benefiting everyone rather than as a personal goal or personal badge of merit. Moreover, we tend to assume that the students who come to our classes are literate and will know how to do school. Right? They'll know what the expected classroom procedures, what the routines are, and they will have developed the ability, the familiarity with academic ways of thinking and the ability to engage in academic decontextualized tests. Going back to that slide where we had the picture of the toy, thinking back where you start at such a young age. So you're able to think academically in terms of decontextualized tests such as classification, comparing, contrasting analysis, and so on. So basically what we've done is we've looked at the assumptions of our system. If we think back to the students with limited interrupted formal education, they have very different perspectives about teaching and learning. They're contrasting paradigms, what we see here. And basically, I have here on this next slide, I have a schematic, and it says 2 different learning paradigms. And I have SIFE, the Students with Limited Interrupted Formal Education, on the left side, and U.S. classrooms on the right. Now, before we go through this, I want to emphasize, even though it's set up as a dichotomy, the students with limited and interrupted formal education, it's not they versus us. It's a continuum. And these students range on the continuum depending upon their exposure to literacy and their participation in formal education. Some of the students may come with none, some have some, and some have had more. So there's a whole range. So keep that in mind as I'm going through this. Now, as I go through this, we're going to look at this, and Helene and I conceptualize learning as consisting of 3 aspects: the conditions, the processes, and the activities for learning. And we're going to look at these one by one. First, the conditions. They set the stage. These are the underlying expectations for the learning climate before instruction even begins. Okay. So we have, for example, on their side, we have immediate relevance, right? Whereas we expect future relevance, which we've just discussed. The interconnectedness is so important for them, interdependence, and as Myrna Ann discussed, how that leads to that relational engagement. We want that independence, going it alone. Right, so those are the conditions for learning before learning takes place. Then we have the processes. And the processes are ways we choose to interact with the new material we are learning, our priority in how we want to access the information, how we're going to feel most comfortable doing so. So on the left side for this slide, we see shared responsibility and oral transmission. As we said, they prefer to learn with others as a group, while we believe in individual accountability. Even when we do group work, even when we have cooperative learning, at the end of the day, each student is responsible for his or her own work. Oral transmission, well, because they come from informal ways of learning where literacy is not a priority or not necessary, or they may not have the opportunity to participate in literacy, their first choice is to gather and transmit through oral means, which is the exact opposite of ours. We feel most comfortable. Our preference is for print. And in addition, it's print, not just the ability to read, not just decoding skills, but it is reading as a process for learning, extracting information. And we have to keep that in mind. Now, the third aspect, and this goes back to that chart I said, the needs of students with limited and interrupted formal education, those 2 other aspects that are usually not looked at when we talk about this population. And when we're talking about activities, these are what the learners usually do in order to build and demonstrate competence. They're tasks, okay, that they do in order to demonstrate this mastery. Now, for the SLIFE, they are pragmatic tasks. These are based on more of a mentoring model. There's repeated practice, modeling, immediate feedback. They're tasks that have concrete application and immediate relevancy. As we talked about earlier, what you learn, you implement, and use right then and there. And these are, but from the U.S. classroom system, we have very different types of tasks that we're expecting to demonstrate mastery. They're abstract, they're systematic, decontextualized tasks derived from logic and science. For example, whether you're organizing information or seeing patterns and relationships or defining or whatever. Okay, so what you see now essentially is a contrast between the left and right, keeping in mind, of course, that students with limited and interrupted formal education range on a continuum. But you see the contrast between left and right. Remember the assumption slide I showed you earlier? That's us on the right. And they expect, however, the left, coming from informal ways of learning and thinking and learning, they're expecting immediate relevance and pragmatic tasks. From the collectivism aspect, interconnectedness and shared responsibility. From orality, and they expect oral transmission. So what happens is we encounter something we call or I should say it comes from a borrower called cultural dissonance. And if you remember in Myrna Ann in her first presentation, she talked a lot about culture shock. And she talked about mental health stressors. And cultural dissonance is part of this. For the students, these students with the limited and interrupted formal education, there's a sense of everything about school being off. They're confused, they're lost. And for the teachers, there's the feelings of helplessness and frustration. What can I do? Where do I start? These students don't know anything. They don't know what they should know. Whatever it is, it's this feeling of being lost. So the question we as educators ask ourselves is, what can we do to reduce the cultural dissonance, both on their part and our part, but at the same time foster learning in this new setting? Well, again, Helene Marshall and I have developed together an instructional model. It's a transitional approach to our educational system. We call this transitional approach, this instructional model, the mutually adaptive learning paradigm, for short, MALP. This instructional model takes elements from the student's learning paradigms, elements from our learning paradigm, and focuses on developing the new cultural lens, that is the academic ways of thinking. So you're probably asking yourself, why a model? Well, on one hand, I could just give you a list of activities, but that only will bring you so far. If we work through this model and I show you the applications, I think you're going to understand or have a better understanding of what works, what doesn't, and why with students with limited and interrupted formal education. It will allow you to take best practices and give you insights on how to modify and adopt them for these students. So we're going to take a look at how this works, and I'm going to illustrate it by looking at some classroom applications. Now, and one of the things I want to emphasize we're doing here is by using a transitional model and by understanding the differences in learning paradigms and understanding that's what we're dealing with, we can avoid the deficit approach. So having said that, let's take a look. Now this is called, you'll notice this is the same schematic I had up earlier. You notice, however, there's a difference here. And the difference here is that certain areas are now bolded and highlighted. Okay, I'm just clicking them on, and I'm going to go through them briefly after I've clicked them on. Okay, so what these are, the bolded and shaded, are what make up this instructional model, the mutually adaptive learning paradigm. Right? There's the 3 components with the 6 elements, all of which we need to include in our classroom for this population to succeed. First, we have the conditions. Okay, we have the conditions that this SIFE need in the classroom and which we can accept and accommodate. Okay? These are immediate relevance and interconnectors. We can make sure we provide those in the classroom. Now, under processes, these are remember, these are the preferred ways to interact with the new material being learned. But what's important we have to keep in mind is they have their priorities, we have our priorities. However, we want to transition them to our priorities because only then can they succeed, because they need to develop individual accountability and literacy. So what teachers need to do is make sure that they are constantly developing they're including opportunities, myriad opportunities to combine their priorities and our priorities with many opportunities for shared and individual responsibility, and for that oral transmission is combined with print. Right? So finally, because SLIFE need to develop these academic ways of thinking, we need to focus on tasks that incorporate decontextualized school-based tasks. All right. However, it's very important that when these tasks are first introduced, that we scaffold them with familiar language and content. Okay. Why do we need to have familiar language and content? Because our focus now is on the academic task, that is building and developing this different cultural lens, different way of thinking. Once they've developed this, become familiar with this academic task and develop this different way of thinking, then we can introduce the academic and language and content. Okay. Now I'm going to illustrate the implementation of MALP with 2 activities, and that you'll see that's the first bolded heading, surveys and theme booklets. This is a very short list. Helene and I, in our work, which is listed in the references at the end of the PowerPoint, describe many other kinds of activities. Now, both of these activities, surveys and theme booklets, are an essential practice for this population. And why? Well, essentially because not only can project-based learning include all elements of MALP, but it also provides many, many opportunities for differentiation. And remember when I talked about earlier about the students with limited and interrupted formal education ranging along the continuum and the ways of learning in terms of their exposure to literacy and participation in formal education, and also, of course, language proficiency. So doing project-based learning allows for lots of differentiation for these 3 aspects. It promotes integration of literacy and content knowledge, because we have to bring them, we want to get them there where they get to know what they should know at grade level. It improves student engagement because it's student-centered rather than teacher-centered, and it provides many opportunities for peer learning and peer mentoring. Now, in excuse me, in implementation of any of these activities, such as surveys, theme booklets, or others you can find, it's very important that we have the teachers provide supports. And this was actually supposed to be bolded, but something happened in the transmission. But just keep your mind that this heading is supports. Many of these will be familiar to you, such as graphic organizers, sentence frames, concept posters, and so on. But what is very important here is that these supports for this population should not be considered optional, but are absolutely essential for them for learning and in transitioning them to education U.S. style. Because remember, they are coming from informal ways of learning and a different learning paradigm. So we're trying to transition them by providing scaffolding. And again, you want to avoid the deficit approach, because what you're thinking of is, well, how can I structure my teaching in order to make the tasks that I'm assigning and I'm expecting doable, to use Myrna Ann's words earlier. So let's take a look at the first project. Namely, we're going to look at surveys. And Helene and I talk about in our work about how surveys are an absolutely excellent project for life, and that they provide so many opportunities for all the elements of the mutually adaptive learning paradigms. There's many opportunities for immediate relevance and interconnectedness. For example, students, and with or without the teacher, select topics that interest them. They can find out more about each other's interests and opinions and backgrounds. Oral transmission with print combine naturally. The different steps of a survey project. There are many oral and written components. And then, of course, you've got opportunities for shared and individual responsibility as they are delegated for specific tasks within the survey project. And surveys help develop the ability to do academic tasks scaffolded by familiar language and content. So how do they do this? Well, they have to create a survey, they generate and sequence relevant questions, they present them in a variety of formats, they quantify the responses, find patterns, and report the surveys results in an organized form. So many of you are probably kind of shaking your head at this point and saying, that's not what I know about surveys. Well, I want to emphasize that from the MALP perspective, surveys are not standalone activities. They're not merely data gathering activities that you just, or conversational activity or so on. Something needs to be done with the data gathered in the survey in order to transition them to academic ways of thinking. And I'm going to illustrate this by looking at some classroom applications. And on this next slide, you'll see the heading Free Time Survey. This is an example of a student survey sample. This was part of a much larger project on the Civil War. And I just wanted to kind of have you look at this survey. In the survey, the students would talk about their lives outside of school, the student and teacher learn more about each other's interests, and they share what when they share what they do when they're bored. That was the activities for battling boredom is the headline. And you can immediately see, if you think back to the earlier slide that illustrated the mutually adaptive learning paradigm with the bolded and shaded elements, you'll see the immediate relevance here, interconnectedness, opportunities for shared individual responsibility, and a combination of oral and written. These are all leading our preparation for academic tasks. And we're going to see this on the next slide. And on the next slide, you'll see a bar graph. Right now, a bar graph, again, this is a part of that larger Civil War unit I mentioned to you. But this is the final product for the survey activity. Now, one of the things that the teacher who did this had found was, in working with the math teacher, that the math teacher found students were having a lot of problems with bar graphs, which is not surprising, because bar graphs represent academic ways of thinking. It's an academic task that you are being asked to produce. But yet by the end of this, you'll see that they are engaged in academic ways of thinking, doing the bar graph, but they started out with a familiar language and content. So the focus was on the task, scaffolded by the language and content that they knew from the survey. Then they could move on to the math problems. So students became cognitively engaged in an academic task that they weren't previously because it had been appropriately scaffolded. Now, of course, I do need to emphasize that this did not happen overnight. There were many, many steps in this project, and I've listed just a few leading up to the bar graph. You can see these are some of the major ones here. Now, in addition, the teacher, besides these things listed, she used supports. Remember back to the earlier support when I talked about the classroom supports, learning supports. Here is an example of graphic organizer, specifically Venn diagram. Now in this Venn diagram, you'll notice on the left side, we have a large one. This was done in class. It was a brainstorming one that started out. The teacher listed the things the students produced, and then she had them work in pairs individually on their own Venn diagrams, and they worked in pairs as they gathered information about the Civil War soldiers from a website the teacher had pre-selected for the students, and they were individually responsible for filling out their own portions. So when going back to MALP, I think you can see now how in this survey project all the elements are present. Now I'd like to move on to our second activity, namely theme booklets. Now these are organized collections of information that students gather and prepare in written form on a specific topic. Like surveys, these incorporate the elements of MALP, of the mutually adaptive learning paradigm, and they are another project-based learning, so they incorporate all those aspects also. Another additional benefit of theme booklets is the class is actually creating a library of their own that they can refer to, they can share with new students, or they can share with the family or community. Now, there are many, many types of theme booklets, and one that I'm going to talk about today is the welcome booklet, which goes back to what Myrna Ann mentioned earlier about needing to become familiar with familiar routines and procedures. She mentioned, for example, students were holding themselves back because they didn't know how to use the facilities. They weren't familiar with the procedures. Well, the particular welcome booklet I'm looking at, I'm going to show you, it talks about another procedure, another aspect, namely lockers. Right? And the students develop welcome booklets based on what they themselves found difficult or confusing. And these welcome booklets can be an ongoing project. As new students come in, they may have other difficulties. They can try other things. Pages can constantly be added. It can be saved for future students in the following year, and of course, again, modified as needed. Now, I've run through very, very quickly two projects, again, in the interest of time, and I will refer you to the references at the end of the PowerPoint, where you can see my work with Helene Marshall, where we go into great depth on project-based learning, mutually adaptive learning paradigm, and of course, all the supports. Now, I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about the supports in a little bit more. The graphic organizers, word wall, sentence frames, teacher-made concept posters and student-produced posters. Because remember, we're working to transition this population to a different learning paradigm, our settings. And to do so, we want to provide a great deal of scaffolding. Now, earlier I already mentioned graphic organizers. I showed you the Venn diagram, the class Venn diagram for brainstorming, and then the students' Venn diagrams. And I just want to show you briefly another type of graphic organizer. And this is, the next two slides show you a hanging mobile about books they're reading. What they're doing here is learning to identify characters and major events in the story, and they're learning how to take the story apart, so to speak. So it's an academic or a task. It's a school way of thinking. It's different than if you just listen to a story and appreciate it. Again, so this is, again, so here you have one other type of graphic organizers. There are many websites that have hundreds of graphic organizers. I only want to caution you to think in terms of MALP, the mutually adaptive learning paradigm, when you choose which one you're going to use. Another important support is sentence frames. And the purpose of a sentence frame is that the students focus on content, not grammatical structure. Yet the repetition provided by they're always using the same structure gives them important contextualized, meaningful practice of the structure. Now, on the left side, you'll see a photo from a math class. You'll see questions and answers with boxes around the math that they need to focus on. That's what they need to supply. The English, the language, is given to them. So, again, their attention is solely on the math. On the right side, you have a little different photo. This is taken from another project described in my other work with Helene. It is on collections, and it focuses, this whole thing is focusing on defining, right? So what happens is, defining is the most common question asked in the classroom. For example, what is X? Something that never happens in informal learning, and that's not important. You ask, what is a tree? You look at a tree, or you point to a tree. But this, again, is an academic task that we need to transition them to. We have to train them how to do this. And here's some examples of sentence frames. So they're not focused on the language, but they're focused on the content, how to do this task. Okay, the next one I quickly want to look at is word walls, commonly found in elementary classrooms, but less so in secondary. Very effective with this students with limited and interrupted formal education. This one happens to be math, but it can be for any content area, and we want to think of it as a reference source that can be updated for the students and can be switched out frequently. Then we look at teacher-made concept posters, and I want to emphasize the importance of the teachers making concept posters rather than using commercial ones, because they are personalized for the classroom and they have thus more relevance and meaning. If you look at this one, for example, the teacher has the vertical, diagonal, and horizontal sides of a triangle, and what she's included is things that the students gave her that have meaning to them, such as a vertical would be a building, or a diagonal would be a hill, or horizontal might be a path. And the last one I want to look at is the student-made posters. These are students that are made to help them understand the concepts, the subject matters that they're learning. These can be put up around the classroom. They can keep themselves for reference, or you can even build a portfolio of them to use with future students. Now, these then are just a few essential supports for students with limited and interrupted formal education. And again, I refer you to the references for more. In conclusion, I hope that I've been able to provide you with an understanding of the two very different learning paradigms. Okay, theirs, informal ways of learning, and ours, formal education, both of which lead to very different ways of understanding and interpreting the world around us, including how to learn and how to teach, and our assumptions about teaching and learning. And this gets us away from the deficit view of this population. And I also hope that you have a better sense of how you as a teacher can assist the students with limited or interrupted formal education, develop those very important academic ways of thinking, and adapt to the cultural differences in learning and teaching by doing MALP. That is, as you see from this slide, using the mutually adaptive learning paradigm in other words, accepting the learning conditions that we can accommodate and that they need for learning, combining essential learning processes from both perspectives, transitioning them, and then focus on academic tasks that are initially scaffolded using familiar language and content, and incorporating project-based learning with lots and lots of support, such as graphic organizers, sentence frames, concept posters, and on, all with the intention of promoting cognitive and emotional engagement. So I'm going to return to the question I posed earlier, why an instructional model? And I want to leave you with the following. You can give a man a fish and he will eat for a day. But you can teach a man to fish and he will eat for his lifetime. The same idea underlies the mutually adaptive learning paradigm. Thank you. I have here additional resources if you're interested. You can check later.
Thank you so much, Andrea, for that wonderful presentation, and we have a great set of resources from both our presenters. I do have a couple of questions that have been asked in the chat, and to all of our participants, I want you to please feel free to type in more questions as we go through, as we ask questions. I'm just going to illustrate where the chat box is. There you go. So you just type into that little white space right underneath the chat box there, and your question will appear for us. The first question that I have is from Susie, and she says, there are students from cultures that value independent work, and cooperative learning is a struggle. Suggestions for this population of students for either of our presenters?
Well, I could start by saying one of the things that we emphasize in our work is that we should always provide opportunities for students to work individually when they want to. However, depending on the program in the school, a lot of the schools are moving toward cooperative learning, and even mainstream students who may not feel comfortable are being asked to participate in this. It's another way of learning that they also need to be comfortable with. They don't need to do cooperative learning or shared work all the time. And they need to understand that there are opportunities for both in the classroom and that they are expected to do both. In addition, when we talk about differentiated learning, one of those aspects can be to provide those students who need more opportunities to do it on their own to do it on their own. Myrna, do you have anything, Myrna Ann, anything you could add?
One of the things that I think is helpful when we're talking about being explicit sometimes is to literally talk about cultural differences. So I think, first of all, we have to be really careful about our stereotypes and our assumptions, which I did not say in the beginning. I think it's very helpful to learn all we can about where specific groups of people have come from, what the backgrounds are, that kind of thing. And then we have a base of knowledge we can depart from when we look at individual behavior. And individual behavior is not the same, but is influenced by culture. So we all have our sort of personal culture as well. But I do find it helpful, even with students, to talk about this strange American culture. I mean, I often use that phrase. You don't need to use that. But I think we can be very explicit, even at a fairly early age, about some of the things that are in the American school system or in the ways that we learn that may differ. Because I find that these students really can benefit from seeing some comparison. I think our knowledge and adapting our teaching and our own learning actually to the differences can be very helpful. But I think we can also be explicit about that as a way of learning about culture.
But I think I'm sorry, Myrna Ann, I'm sorry. I think you brought a very important point that we shouldn't overgeneralize, and we don't want to just say, oh, you're from culture X, so you must be this way, or we're all that way. However, and then there are many, many resources that address that, and that teachers should be aware that they really do need to learn who their students are, not only as from who they are from their culture, but also who they are as individuals, because there are always individual variances also, and many different subcultures within any given culture.
Thank you. Our next question is Anthony, who asks, how does a teacher pre and post assess the SLIP skills, S-L-I-P, and you, I'm hoping that one of the presenters can help me out with what that acronym means. That's not one that's familiar to me, or perhaps Anthony could elaborate.
I'm not familiar with that.
Perhaps Anthony could elaborate in the chat box, and I'll turn to the next question from Laura, who says, I'm wondering about students arriving in the middle of the school year with little formal education. Has anyone had major success with providing some sort of alternative school before they enter into the mainstream high school?
I can speak briefly to start that. Yes, there are many places that have newcomer schools and newcomer high schools, the gamut of levels. Sometimes those are incorporated into a regular traditional school, and sometimes those are standalone. There are lists and there are resources to look at some of those. One of the most successful very early on, as you might guess, was in California, but many states now are doing some modification of that. I did some work on for the school district in Alaska a couple years ago, and it was very interesting. In Alaska, they had Hmong students long after the Hmong were the major population coming, and they also had a lot of Somalis coming to Alaska. And they had done some very successful experimentation with essentially a newcomer school, but it was part of the regular school that students went to before they were mainstreamed.
I also believe that Cal Center for Applied Linguistics has a publication of newcomer schools in the United States and a discussion of those, and that might be something else to look at.
This is Joanne. I want to add to that question. For districts that are very large or in rural areas where the concentration of these students might not be sufficient to have a center, but you still have a few of those students, particularly at the secondary level, districts have found it efficient and effective to self-contain these students for a period of time. That means create a section within their middle school or high school in which you bring these students together in and one or two teachers work with them all day long in preparation for joining the regular ESL program, but they're still housed in the regular neighborhood building, and that can be proved an effective way of transitioning them.
Our next question is from Lindsay, and this is a question about home language. And she says, during cooperative learning activities, students often tend to lean on their native languages quite a bit if they are in groups with others who speak that language. It can become a crutch. Do you have suggestions on how to overcome that barrier?
This is Andrea. I would say that remember, if they have very limited proficiency, they can use that. I wouldn't say it as a crutch, as another support, where they're using it to help them understand the tasks and the activities they are being asked to complete. I mean, the final work can be in English, but they need something to help transition. They're not fluent yet. They're working at it. And if this helps them access the information, helps them produce the product, I don't see a problem with it.
Just an added comment, you know, I think in the field of working with limited English proficient or whatever acronym ESOL students, the thinking, I would say, like is somewhat like culture. It's sort of like a fast-moving river, and I think we'll continue to look at this particular issue. When I started in the field, the common thinking was in the classroom, everything had to be in English or we were putting people at a disadvantage. I think our thinking has moved far beyond that, but I appreciate your question in terms of how much native language and how do you offer some coordination, if not control, on what's used, because after all, if students are going to succeed at some point, they have to be able to do it in English. So this isn't a sort of a recipe in terms of an answer, but I agree with Andrea that I think to use native language also can help people feel comfortable. It can give them an opportunity to be successful with an activity, rather than saying you're in an American school and you must only learn English. But I hear under your question that that balance is hard to achieve, and I agree that it is. I think it's another one of those things when you're putting out the rules, even if it's not an overall rule, but it's a rule for a specific activity, the more you can be clear about the expectation, even about using native language. And I would not say you can't use it, but you can put out some expectations in terms of how it's used and how much is used. So in fact, people will feel comfortable when they are using it, when it's facilitative, rather than feeling they're getting around what they're supposed to be doing.
I would add to that the use of the native language can be very effective when you're trying to make sure the students understand the academic content. But the final product or the output then should be in English. And the process of getting them to that output in English allows for the use of native language as a tool for learning the same content in English and the corresponding vocabulary in English.
Our next question is about high school graduation. Andy asks, how are students earning credits towards graduation at the high school level when they have limited formal education and issues with English language acquisition? And just to remind you again for our presenters to make sure you do switch your microphone on.
Well, this is Joanne. I'll try to address that question. I don't know if Andrea is offline or what, but the issue of high school credits is very challenging, and many districts and states are allowing additional years for completion of all the graduation requirements. So they're allowing for students to complete their high school requirements in more than 4 years. There are ways in which you can build in some credit accumulation by using elective courses and trying to support the students in other ways, but obviously they are going to need additional time to be able to be at a level that will allow them to accumulate sufficient high school credits.
This is Andrea. Just to build on that, not only do they sometimes districts or schools provide extra years or allow for extra years, they will also offer extended day and Saturday academies where the students at that point are working additionally in order to help them be able to participate in the classes, the mainstream classes that they are often required to take, which may or may not parallel, or they may be, depending on the size of the students, the population of students with limited interrupted formal education, they may be together with other Ls. So these extended day and Saturday academies may act to support their participation in those classes. And another, going back to the alternative schools and newcomer schools, which is another way of providing extra years, that the students start off with 1 or 2 years there before they go into credit-bearing classes. Or
just a comment. I appreciate the question, actually, because we have worked in some schools that had limited numbers of students with interrupted education, and have actually been asked the question, wouldn't it be better if they weren't in the school and they were instead outside studying for vocation and not trying, given where they're starting from, to graduate? So the fact that the question, and I think that some of this is not spoken, but we've actually been asked that directly. So I think the very question about how are different schools in different states dealing with this is an excellent one, because I think, of course, we want to find ways for all children to succeed, and it's really difficult with this population and the norm in terms of how many years and what it means to get out of school. But I have had the question, wouldn't it be better if the person goes into vocation and maybe at some point takes the GED?
I want to add also that for a comprehensive answer to that question, our previous webinar on this subject had a presentation by Teddy Pudaris from Fairfax County Public Schools in Virginia on some of the district level resources and infrastructure that particular district provides. So I would definitely recommend that. That is available from Incella's website if you'd like to look at that presentation. Our next question is about literacy instruction. Karen asks, at what point would you recommend introducing instruction on abstract literacy skills, including letter sound correlation, sight words, etc.?
This is Andrea. I just want to emphasize I am not a literacy expert, and there are differences of opinions on this, but when we talk about the idea of transitioning them and combining the oral and written modes, we want to include literacy skills from the beginning. So whatever they produce orally, you want to somehow give it to them in writing. And we understand, of course, that they come with no background. It's going to be, or come from a non-alphabetic system of learning, it's going to be harder, but it should be introduced right from the beginning. But again, combined with the oral and with the written. And they can begin with these theme booklets as one example that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, which is very, very basic, with just very simple words. And I don't like to use this analogy because people sometimes misunderstand me, but if you look at what teachers do in the elementary, in pre-K, first and second grade, don't look at necessarily the childishness of it, but you look what they're doing to teach students how to read and write. If we take a lot of these techniques, a lot of these supports, these work well with this population also. Keeping in mind that it needs to be adapted and modified for adolescents and adults. So you can't just take a page out of a book written for a kindergartner and use it for them.
One of the and this is Myrna Ann, one of the pilot projects we did with the grant we had from the National Office of Refugee Settlement was to look at the use of iPads, and I must admit even our teachers were very skeptical about putting younger students, and we also work with adults, with a technology where they had absolutely no background. But I bring it up here because and I think the other challenge with using this technology is that there is so much stuff out there. Sorting through what is really helpful and not is a challenge, and we have some things that can be helpful in that regard. But I introduce it here because this is one of the ways that we have used to introduce even the very basic literacy that we have been amazed at the success. And I know it's being used K-12 as well as using it with older adults who had absolutely no background, and pretty remarkable results.
I'd like to just build on that also. I'm very glad you brought up technology, Myrna Ann. We've been seeing great success with the computer literacy. The students, have great, especially the older ones, have a lot of difficulty because they don't have the muscle control in forming the letters and learning how to write by hand. But they are absolutely fascinated by computers, and they can do amazing projects. They can do amazing work, even though they've never seen a computer. In ways that you would be surprised at, and they become so engaged in it, in being able to look at the work that they've done and sharing it with other members of the classroom. And it encourages, it's an indirect way, some you might say, of encouraging literacy, but it does work.
Well, thank you so much. We are very close to the end of our allotted time here, so I want to thank both of our presenters, Andrea DeCapua and Myrna Ann Adkins. I want to let all of our participants know that the webinar archive will be available on Incella's website within the next couple of days, and also that the PowerPoint is available for you to print out and to provide to your colleagues or to keep for your own records. The previous webinar that I mentioned is also available from Incella's website. I'm sorry we haven't had time to get to all of your excellent questions today, but I want to thank you again for your participation in today's webinar.